This conference will now be recorded.
Let's
Good
review.
timing.
That
Yeah.
was amazing timing.
This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome to Two Lean Guys podcast. I'm Uncle D, and with me, as always, is Johnny Hustle.
Hello,
Where in the
everybody.
world is Johnny Hustle today?
Johnny Hustle is, oddly enough, just slightly north of where Dr. Bob is, and just outside of Hartford.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Johnny. And with us, of course, our guest today is Dr. Bob Emiliani. Dr. Bob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be with you today.
You know, I was preparing for this podcast and I started to review how prolific your writing has been. And, people can go to your website, Dr. Bob Emiliani, or bobemiliani.com rather, but your pedigree is ridiculous. The amount of awards you've won, both in industry and in education. You've been able to provide a lot of thought leadership over the years, going on 20 plus years now. So thank you for everything you've done.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's been my pleasure. I've had a lot of fun doing it. That's for sure. Wouldn't
John and
wouldn't
I, John
have
and I
that
are
much
swearing
output
off.
if it wasn't fun.
Well, if you have fun doing it, then that's kind of the key, right?
Yep, indeed.
So, Bob, what really triggered our engagement in understanding a little bit more about your perspective is in our pursuit as two lean guys to really understand what it takes to become a world-class lean enterprise and sustain it.
Mhm.
That challenge comes from a lot of different perspectives and has a conversation we're going to begin with industry, government, and education. And so today you represent really two of those lanes, in my opinion. So what we were going to talk about heavily is some of your thoughts in this book you've written, The Triumph of Classical Management over Lean Management.
Yeah.
And the most important part to me is, and what to do about it.
Yep.
So if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a little bit about how this came about and really what your driving purpose was.
Sure. So I worked in industry for 15 years, and upon leaving industry in 1999, I took with me what I had learned from the Shingijutsu Kaizen consultants who had taught us TPS, and I brought that into the world of higher education. And I developed over the years something called the lean teaching pedagogy, applying TPS principles and practices to teaching. In addition, when I left industry and joined academia, I had as a major research focus lean leadership. So back in 1999, I was the first one to focus on lean leadership as an area for to study. And of course, um, that being the case, you'd want to answer questions that were existing at the time, as what is a lean leader, what do they do, um, how do what do followers need to do to how do they react to lean leaders, and so on. And so there was a bunch of research questions that I spent about 10 years working on answering, related to how do lean leaders think, how do they behave, what is it that they do, how can you tell a lean leader from a non-lean leader, and so on. And so I produced a number of research papers and some books on that particular topic. But around 2007, and much before that, but around 2007, I started to turn my attention to why lean is not more commonplace, and why do people struggle with this so much? Why is it so hard to create lean leaders? Why are lean transformations so rare? And what's causing that? So, most researchers at that time were still focused on the kind of I guess the sort of the upside of how do you achieve a lean transformation and so forth. Anyway, I started looking at the opposite end of the spectrum here of what's going on and so on. And so I've been looking at that for the last 12 years, and I did a lot of writing on that particular topic, but a certain piece of research that I started doing in 2015 or 16 led to what you now have as that book, Triumph of Classical Management over Lean Management. And, the subtitle is And What to Do About It. And I offer some ideas on what to do about it. But I think it's important to understand that the case that I make as to why classical management continues to triumph over lean management, overall, we have specific examples of successful lean transformation and so forth. But overall, why it continues to triumph over lean management. The case I make is trying to inspire people to think of their own ideas of what they can do to do about this situation. So a common reaction that I get from readers is they're not satisfied with my solutions to the problem, and they wish
work harder.
Yeah, they wish that I had the answers to give to them, and I don't. I have some answers that I think are practical and reasonable, and that, by the way, is a defining theme of all my work, having come from industry, that my work has to have relevancy to the real world and connectivity to the real world. But the readers are having a difficult time of thinking of some of their own ideas of what to do about it, and I certainly understand that. But together we have to get our heads together and figure out what we can do about this. Basically, if we remain stuck on the surface level causes of why we have this problem of not so many lean leaders and very few successful lean transformations and so on, and success defined by things like flow and just in time and the culture change, basic characteristics like that, but the problem remains stuck, or people remain stuck on things like it's a lack of leadership commitment, it's the wrong leadership behaviors, the training is poor, the focus is lean tools, the metrics are wrong, leaders resist change, leaders aren't going to the Gemba. They're coming up with all these kinds of things. Leaders don't understand lean as a strategy and so forth. And if we just continue to operate at that level of understanding of what the problem is, you'll just never get there. It's impossible.
I would agree. I don't mean to interrupt, but on that point, you bring up something interesting right out of the gate. And I don't mean to make this a book review, but right out of the gate on page 13, you talk about denial. And I believe there are a lot of people in pre-contemplation. They're not even thinking, right? They believe they're right. They believe their intentions are good. They're not even contemplating that their behavior could be part of the problem. And I thought that was interesting because that sort of sets the tone for personal accountability throughout the book.
There is that. That's correct. Yeah.
What you were saying, where people struggle, I think it just looks like more work and hard work in overalls. And I think people struggle with the ability for their understanding of all the different dynamics that kind of pull on this.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was really cued into this post you put up recently about why lean management is such a big struggle. And the image has been like kind of seared in my mind about this, the weight on the brain.
Yeah, I mean, basically it says, why is lean management such a big struggle? It's because leaders are anchored to classical management. It shows a brain, and at the stem of the brain, which is the oldest part of the human brain, there's an eyelet screw, and attached to that are anchors that you typically would moor a boat, offshore or in a cove, and it shows the nature of the anchors that are chained to the brain, which is economic, social, political, historical, philosophical, legal, and business. So there's basically 7 anchors that are weighing them down. And what makes this problem so difficult is if you can sort of cut one anchor out of the way, you still got 6 more. And if you can cut 2 or 3, you've still got a bunch more anchors. And what the image doesn't give justice to is showing how these anchors are connected. So if you were to think of some wiring that was between all 7 of these anchors, and they communicate with one another, and to reinforce certain preconceptions, principally related to the status quo, as it relates to classical management, which is something that's been around for in different forms for hundreds and more like thousands of years. Then it's a very difficult problem that we are facing. And so, what I highlight, what can be done about it, is it's an attempt to say, here's what can be done about it, but other people got to get in the act here and also start to put the brain power to it.
Bob,
Yeah.
what we also understand while we're dealing with a lot of manufacturers, or any business for that matter, is that you don't have to be a manager to be a leader.
Mhm.
And we find that you got to make sure that all the internal leaders are rowing in the same direction.
Yeah.
And when you've got management folks who are supposed to be leading, who don't know how to really harness the power of those other non-official leaders, it really it's like adding 2 more anchors to that diagram. So uh, all of the efforts that Dennis and I try to apply really go along with, and again, we keep coming back to our philosophy of flying geese. Keep coming back to the fact that teamwork and getting alignment amongst the team is really so dreadfully important in order to make all these things happen.
It is. And, one of the challenges we face is, if you're high up in a company of almost any size, chances are that you've been in that job or in a managerial job for 20 or 30 years, and you have a certain understanding of the way things are. And of course, TPS and Lean represent completely different ways of thinking across those 7 dimensions: economic, social, political, et cetera, et cetera. And so executives have a difficult time with that, and it manifests itself as an apparent disinterest or resistance to lean management. And so you don't have the teamwork. It doesn't take root in the organizations, and so we see surprisingly few lean transformations. But one of the things I like to point out to people is that classical management is based on preconceptions, and TPS and lean are based on perceptions. And so, as you know, in lean, it's, go to the Gemba, go see with your own eyes, get the facts, work with your hands, and so on. And this is all perception, a way of managing a business by perception. And it's not the only thing. There is some, of course, data and analysis and so forth, and some stuff on a computer screen, and some stuff on a spreadsheet that you look at. But in classical management, while there's that, as well, but there's also just a load of preconceptions based upon economic, social, political, et cetera. And it's a very important point to understand that the classical management is built on preconceptions, and TPS and lean are built on perceptions. And remember what Ono said: you have to destroy all your preconceptions, and it turns out not too many people want to do that, not too many people are motivated to do that, and so on. The other thing I've tried to emphasize to people with that book is you need to know what you're up against. And this is something that people just have not understood. When they talk about it's a lack of leadership commitment and not going to the Gemba, and lean isn't understood as a strategy, these are all surface level manifestations of the problem. And when Triumph of Classical Management digs into all the horrible details and basically says, hey, we're up against something that's really big here, much bigger than we ever imagined it to be, and therefore our strategies and tactics for overcoming the problem, and even just our basic understanding of the problem, it all has to change. And what I see happening in the last almost 2 years since that book was published is just more of the same. Unfortunately, that the influencers are just sort of that they have their own status quo that they're engaged in, and they've established a certain direction to go in to try to get people to adopt lean and so on, and they're just staying on that same path and unlikely to yield good results because it hasn't really yielded good results in the last 30 years.
No, there's been 4 or 5 books that have come out recently, past couple of years, about why lean transformation fails. I mean, you're note by note hitting, of course, the stuff that John and I see on a day by day, by month by year basis.
Yeah.
And the dynamic that you picture of the wiring in relation to all those 7 dynamics that pull on the brain, I think there's another facet that interests me about the idealism, realism, pragmatism.
Yeah.
You know, how a lean person sees it, how a finance person sees it,
Yeah.
your perception notion.
Yeah. That
So,
was, yeah. Well, I was just going to say that was a very interesting mini research project trying to understand, a lot of economics, political and social stuff is rooted in Western thinking. And so when you sort of dig into the details of the philosophy of business, what is the philosophy of business? And it's a westernized philosophy of business for the most part that's been very influential worldwide over the last few hundred years. That, coming up with that business philosophy triangle as a way to explain what's going on was an interesting challenge. So that's basically a distillation of a bunch of reading on that topic. I tried to make a I don't know what it was 100,000 words into one picture.
well, a picture speaks 1,000 words, right? I
Yeah.
think in that particular case, it's very evident that it's another dynamic that's pushing on why these things fail. And so John and I think that there's a challenge. Our challenge out there is a lack of relevant situational awareness is causing crossfire in industry, government, and education
Hmm.
that results in lost potential of human resources.
Oh yeah.
And so why we had Bruce on first, and you know Bruce Hamilton, of course,
Absolutely. Yeah.
is because he says, yeah, that there's a reason you have to pay attention to the technical pieces of lean, but it's like 90% of it is really people, as you know.
Hmm.
And so total employee engagement is his big notion. And I think that if you are involved in trying to know why things fail, the information that comes from the book is useful only if you're open to receiving it, right? So I find that a lot of people, you try to give them new information. If they don't want to hear it, they're not prepared to receive it.
Right.
But Bob, in your experience, what are some of the things people can do right away that are basic and simple ways to engage employees in the effort of trying to treat people with respect, engage them in a way that in 2019 builds a relationship for the long term for them, for the company, for society, etc.
Well, I know when I was in industry and learning TPS from our Kaizen consultants, our Shingijutsu consultants, that you have to work really hard at it because I mean, I was in a position as a business unit manager when I was learning this stuff. So you have to run your business unit as well as learn this stuff and acquire a lot of new knowledge and information. So, my way of doing the work. So I was a business unit manager in manufacturing. And because that kind of environment is very, personal and one-on-one and small group type of relationship, you're not going to spend time reading things. And I took a lot of work home that related to the business unit, but then I also did a lot of homework related to understanding things about organizational behavior, leadership, TPS, teamwork, and so on to get up to speed because it was apparent that what we were learning from Shingijutsu, there was like huge voids in understanding so many different dimensions of everything.
Can I
And
interrupt for a second?
you have to do a lot of work, to get up to speed, and
Yeah.
then be a couple of
Yeah.
steps ahead of the people in your group, so you could lead them along. Yeah, what's up, John?
So, well, my question around that is, so you found yourself in a situation where you had to take home a lot of homework and you were leading your group. Was your group also engaged in taking work home and doing homework, or did you lay that entirely on your own shoulders?
No, that's on my shoulders. Yeah.
And you see,
I,
and
I
that's
would
part
share.
of that.
Sorry.
And what we're trying to get across to a lot of our listeners is that that's still kind of a Western thing, right? Where the leaders feel like they have got to take on all of that responsibility themselves and not share that amongst their people and get more help, right?
Well, I would share a lot of the information that I was coming up with or coming across with the people in my group
Mm-hmm.
through handouts and sometimes some email summaries of what I was
Sure.
reading and so on. And but I mean, if you're in a leadership position, you do have an extra burden to be, you know, to deal with what's required for that position, and it requires you to do some specific things in relation to learning that might not be demanded to the same extent with people that report to you.
Sure.
You know, the timeline that you'd given in your introduction is interesting as I reflect on it briefly. John and I met in 1999 when you began researching lean leaders.
Mhm.
I was really carrying John's bag, essentially trying to learn more about his experience with TPS and how do we apply it within our target market, which was, of course, manufacturing. And around 2007, when you were looking at why lean isn't as common anymore,
Mhm.
John and I, right around that point, John, that was around Wisdom of Flying Geese time, right?
That's exactly right. That's it.
And John and I really started to look at how the market for training was changing.
Mhm.
And we had to take turns leading, learn from each other, encourage each other, learn from the wisdom of flying geese. And he and I started to address change management more heavily, I think, at that point.
Yeah. Up to
Culture
that
and
up to that point, it was like everybody else. It was all about the tool set and not necessarily about how to change the mindset of the leadership. And then also to recognize that there are more leaders than just the managers,
Right.
and how do we change all hearts and minds? And that was a huge shift in our progress.
Good. Yeah, well, one of the things I also counsel people on is, sometimes your management isn't with you, and so just go ahead and make improvements, and don't trumpet it, don't talk about it, don't make a big deal about it. Just go forward, and in academia, the management really doesn't have any interest in lean, and so I just go about doing my work, improving my work, and I don't make a big deal out of it, and gain more experience, more practice, get better at it, come up with new ideas, and I don't let the fact that bosses aren't on board have uh, uh, any negative bearing on my or negative influence on what I do. I just
that's
move
amazing.
forward
Yeah.
despite them.
Well, and a true champion would do that, right? So we like to think that management's always on board, but if they're not, your heart and mind is in the right place, making things better,
Yeah.
and it's very unlikely you're going to get fired or disciplined
Right.
for showing improvement. So moving
Right. And not
forward
only
with
that,
this,
the
If you
reason why
do,
I do it
if you
is
do
because
get
it's
fired,
fun.
if
It's
you do
fun.
get fired for showing improvement, then you
Yeah.
weren't in the right place.
that's right.
Well, right. to take the hit, but I do it because it's fun. Otherwise, work tends to be pretty boring and routine. And that's the wonderful thing about Kaizen, because most, for the last 100 years or more, work has been broken up into its component elements, and so whatever one does tends to be fairly repetitive. And what Kaizen does is it brings craftsmanship back into work. So
Hmm.
before work was broken apart into its elements and everybody did just one little piece, you had craftsmanship and people doing the whole job from start to finish. And the remarkable thing about Toyota style Kaizen is it brings craftsmanship back to the workplace, and it's something you can do every day in practicing that craft, and certainly do it as part of teamwork, team activities to improve processes and so on. So I like to, I like craftsmanship. I built bicycle frames. My first one in high school, I took a year of metal shop to build the jigs to build bicycle frames. And then in the summer after I graduated, I built my first bicycle frame. So I was like working with my hands. I like craftsmanship. I like making things. If you look on Wikipedia under the word hobbies, you will find that almost every hobby you can think of is making something. And even a hobby like watching movies or reading, people are making images in their heads. They're imagining things. They're creating an image in their head. So it doesn't have to physically be making something with your hands. I love to cook. Why? Because it's creative. You're making something and it tastes good. And if it doesn't, add some hot sauce and move on. But try again
Well,
next time.
John and I are hobbyists, heavy.
Yeah,
I
heavy
came
duty
across,
hobbyists.
I came across a blurb today. I'd like to read it real quick.
Sure.
Scientist, and I don't know who this woman is, Dr. Karen Purvis. Maybe you know who she is.
No.
Scientists have recently determined that it takes approximately 400 repetitions to create a new synapse in the brain, unless it's done with play, in which case it takes between 10 and 20 repetitions. Evidence that the human physiology is fine-tuned for learning through play.
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that was great. I don't know who this woman is, but I thought that John and I play games incessantly with our training.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yep. Yeah, but that's
Um,
one of the things we learned from our Kaizen consultants was to make Kaizen fun by turning it into a hobby.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think in the book Kaizen Forever, I talk about shumilation and not simulation, shumilation, hobby, making a hobby of making simulations of things that flow and then making improvements in the work area. And so, yeah, I agree. You got to make it fun. I mean, this is one of the major errors in the execution of continuous improvement and Kaizen specifically. If you
Right.
throw a party and people have fun, they'll come back when you send them a next invitation. But if you
Right.
throw a party and it's just it's not fun and it's a terrible experience, then they're not gonna come back for the next when the next invitation comes.
Lots of times we say, if you're not laughing, you're not learning.
Yeah,
So we like to make these things as fun as possible, and we like
absolutely.
to we like to laugh. Why not?
it's okay to return to your childlike state of play. It's okay.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
Feeling good is an acceptable goal. This is at least what my wife tells me. Okay.
That's right.
I tend to listen to her because she's a clinical psychologist, but I think a lot of times, people are hard on themselves. They do need to lighten up a little bit. To Bruce Hamilton's point last podcast, leaders just need to lighten up. Let people experiment, and when they fail, that's good sandbox learning, right, Bob?
It is, but I think what the book Triumph of Classical Management provides the empirical evidence that's not the sandbox that they want to learn in.
But just a starter routine to
Yeah.
get people comfortable with breaking that logjam. Shifting the paradigm comes with years, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
does.
I'm more open to learning now than I ever was.
Mhm.
And, John can kind of testify to the radical pursuits I've been on to try to learn this stuff from people like you and others, so that when I stand in front of a group of 20 people, it's relevant. And I can point to information like this to help make it personal for them.
Mhm.
And so that's one of the reasons I'm grateful for the type of information you're putting out of education today. So thank you for that.
Well, yeah, you're welcome. I mean, one of my main things is to make sure that I produce stuff that nobody else is working on, because I think if you've read my stuff, you'll agree that the perspective, the point of view, the subject matter is not what other people are doing, and that's I think a hallmark of my work is its uniqueness. I write about lean leadership, but the way I write about it and how I approach it and so forth is very different than how others do.
Yeah, John and I don't fight about the definition of tools.
Yeah.
and you're able to articulate things that a lot of people feel and think in not those words. So for that reason, I'm grateful for the academic or I would consider education
Yeah.
perspective of our conversation. So in closing, Bob, what we do is a little segment called Plus Delta.
Mm.
And what we do is we go around the room and we each say something that we liked about today and something that we thought could be changed or better, represented by the Delta. If you're okay, I'll be so bold as to go first, and then Johnny, and then we'll ask you to close as our guest.
Okay.
Johnny, if I tee up my Big Bob plus Delta, don't stop me on the runway.
Oh, no, you're good. Keep going.
All right. So, plus Delta, gentlemen. My plus for today is the reinvigoration of learning from you now today, Bob. I had read more of your books back in the real lean leader days. And
Yep.
I think, that this is everything I'm trying to say to a lot of my leaders today to wake them up. And so I'm glad that right out of the gate from the very beginning, you talk about denial because, it's not just a river in the Amazon.
Yeah.
My Delta for me is I wish we could have more time. So I would love to see if you'd be, consider coming back.
Yeah, sure. No problem.
Yeah, share more of our perspective. And so with that, Johnny Dubois, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Bob, Dr. Bob, especially for coming in. And I know that we tried another day to make this happen and had some technical difficulties.
No
So
problem.
my big plus at this point right now is that we were able to make this happen here and now without any technical difficulties.
Mhm.
So we are definitely improving, and I'm very excited about that.
Did you hit the record button?
Yeah.
Just before you close out on we had no technical difficulty.
Right. Yeah,
Uh,
we'll know for sure when we listen to the audio
right.
afterwards. If the audio is just hissing, I guess we're all in trouble. But it give us a
Right.
chance to do this all again, right? And
Yep.
then for a Delta, I'm not sure I have one today. I'm usually pretty critical on myself and others and about this, but I really think this was a very positive discussion, um, and I'm looking forward to the next one.
Yep. Likewise. And so my positive is to meet you two. Because Dennis, we talked on the phone a while, but now on video, I put the face to the name. John, it's nice to meet you as well. And I guess my what was it? That's the Delta Tiger. I guess I should have put some connections between those anchors to show that it's actually in the book. In back there's an image of the seven layers, and it's showing the flow of information between them all. But I left that out of the anchors, and I should have had some sort of wires connecting all those anchors, because there definitely is a communication between them that makes it very hard to disentangle.
Okay, that was my Delta 2 then.
Yeah.
No,
Oh,
I'm kidding.
get out of here, man. Get out of here. Well, we're self-professed lean nerds, and so we really appreciate someone else taking the lead and creating a message that resonates. So your information is really relevant, Bob. Just for our listeners, the triumph of classical management over lean management, how tradition prevails and what to do about it. Dr. Bob Emiliani. Thank you, sir. Have a great
Yeah.
day.
You too.
This is Johnny Hustle and Uncle D saying thank you for listening. As always, peace.
Peace. And
This conference will now be recorded.
shoot.